Hello, welcome to History 217, Lecture 8, Populism. In this lecture, I will be going over general U.S. history, describing populism in the nation as a whole. And then as you read your chapter on Nevada history populism, you'll be able to connect Nevada populism to the nation as a whole. First, what is populism? Populism is a late 19th century political movement that pitted the working class, farmers, factory workers, against the moneyed interests of the day. Farmers, factory workers, working class Americans, lower class Americans, many begin to argue during this era that the political parties of the day, the Democrat and Republican parties, did not meet the needs of regular people, that they were in bed with the moneyed interests or the special interests. And so populism is a political movement that focuses on having farmers, factory workers' political needs met. Populist rhetoric focused on the abuses of the wealthy against the poor. There's four changes that we can talk about. Well, three changes, and then perceived unfair treatment by banks and railroad companies. Agriculture farmers during this era experienced a drop in status, a drop in income, and a drop in importance to the economy. When you study pre-Civil War America, what do you notice? There's no negative terms for rural folk, farmers. They're farmers, rural, past the pastoral life is celebrated in American culture. Why is that? Well, before the Civil War, what's the stereotype of the United States and colonial America? We're a nation of farmers, right? Agriculture. And so before the Civil War, you don't see the pejorative terms about rural folk or farmers that you see afterwards. In the late 19th century, as millions of Americans moved to the cities or come from other countries and live in large cities, the urban centers of the nation, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, become the place to be culturally, become more popular culturally. And so during this era, the late 19th century, is when we start to see farmers and rural folk have negative terms applied to them. Hick, hayseed, country bumpkin, deplorable, evil, just all these negative terms that we give them, simply because they live in rural parts of the country. During the late 19th century, when you study agricultural prices, we see a general decline in the prices of crops over the late 19th century for farmers. Add an economic depression and a drought, and farmers' income over the late 19th century continues to drop pretty severely. In the late 19th century, it's very difficult to be a farmer and to make a living at it. As the Second Industrial Revolution develops the U.S. manufacturing sector in the late 19th century, agriculture becomes less important to the economy. And that's one argument why we might argue, that politicians in the late 19th century are paying less attention to farmers and factory workers and more attention to the manufacturing owners and factories that are developing the United States into a manufacturing giant. High interest rates, quick foreclosing proceedings causes a lot of farmers to believe that banks and railroads are out to get them. And so they're getting the short end of the stick in the economic cycles of the late 19th century. So we want to take a quick look at why farmers, factory workers, miners for Nevada, especially farmers, why they're feeling so much angst about the late 19th century and they're placed in it to the point where they feel are being ignored by Washington, D.C. and by the economy. Remember, owning land during this period, 19th century, 1817 on back, owning land is a sign of wealth. Not having money, paper money like we have today, but owning land was a sign of your wealth. It was also a sign that you were truly independent and free. And so what we see in the late 19th century is this cycle of debt and poverty causes farmers to lose their farm, become sharecroppers or tenant farmers, or have to move to the city and participate in like the less noble work of factory work. Okay. So in some ways, as farmers, they feel like they're losing their freedom and corrupting themselves by leaving a noble work. Here's a price index for consumer products and farm products during the late 19th century. The green area represents prices are high enough that farmers or agricultural workers can make enough money to survive. If you notice, most of the section, especially the later half of the period we're studying, do not make enough money to survive. This is the era. This is the era here, the late 19th century here, where we start to see farmers farmers having to abandon the countryside and head to the city. The patrons of husbandry and farmers' alliances aren't as significant for Nevada as they are for the Midwest, but we can talk about how farmers during this era attempt to organize politically and economically. First, the patrons of husbandry, the Grange. The goal was to advance farmers' political goals through political action, campaigning for certain candidates, and even running as populist candidates themselves. Farmers' alliances were meant to circumvent the middleman, circumvent the people that you feel you're screwing you over, banks and railroad industry. So what do? You form cooperatives. If the market is not giving you a good price for your crops, you sell it to your cooperative. Need a loan, you go to your cooperative. Grandeur law is more significant in the Midwest, but in the 1870s, several Midwestern states passed laws regulating railroads. One example, same rate for the same line, and other regulations. This may not appear dramatic to you and me because, we're used to a government that interferes with business quite a bit. And so we kind of lose sight that during the 19th century, these grandeur laws are pretty radical, as it's an attempt to have government regulate private industry to the benefit of farmers. For Nevada history, the People's Party is important. In Nevada, populists will rename themselves populists or silver Democrats, depending on whether they were Democrats or populists. The People's Party was formed in the early 1890s, and as we mentioned before, it's a coalition of farmers, factory workers, working class Americans. Their critique was that the politics of the era, Democrat and Republican parties, are too in bed with the moneyed interests and not serving the needs of regular people. (1892) is the famous Omaha Platform, which gives a somewhat comprehensive platform for the populist era. System of sub-treasuries, which we have today, the Federal Reserve. Abolition of the national bank, because the argument was the wealthy and the elite are using the national bank to maintain their power. Direct election of senators. This is big for Nevada. A lot of Nevada voters, there's populists everywhere. In the 19th century, state legislatures picked your senators. So you get it? You're a Nevada miner, Nevada farmer, Nevada, working class person. You consider the state legislature corrupt because they're serving the interests of the mine owners and not you. And then they're electing corrupt U.S. senators to go to Washington, D.C. So populists of the era called for direct election of senators, regular people picking the senators, because you're not in the back pocket of the moneyed interests, right? And so theoretically, you'll make better decisions, or at least you'll pick senators that like you, more than mine owners. Government ownership of railroads, telephone and telegraph companies, government-operated postal savings banks, restriction of undesirable immigrants. The 8-hour workday, that's more for factory workers and government employees. Abolition of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, the Australian secret ballot. Remonetization of silver, extremely important for Nevada. We're the silver state, right? After the Comstock lode peters out in the late 1870s, Nevada goes through a pretty big depression, economic downturn. It gets so bad, some people start wondering if Nevada shouldn't be a state anymore. And so the remonetization of silver for the Nevada silver industry was viewed as a way to restart the Nevada economy and get it going again. And then a single term for president and vice president. In populism, 19th century populism looks a lot like 20th century populism as well. Historians do make the connection between populism and progressivism. One historian argued that progressivism is simply populism to take a shower, put a suit on, and a bowler hat. So, in other words, working class populism simply is middle class progressivism. Here's a cool populist song during the 1896 election. Campaigns back then would make up their own campaign songs, and so here's one. The New York World published it on October 11th, 1896, and it's Nevada's Little Silver Mine. So you can look that over. Thank you for watching History 217, Lecture 8, Populism.